I stood on the stone steps outside my son's in-laws' grand estate, my fingers stiff and unmoving against the cold brass handle, while through the heavy mahogany door I could clearly hear my daughter-in-law, Jessica, speaking, her voice calm and reassuring in the evening air as she said, "Don't worry, Mom. Mark's father is fine. He's just simple. You just have to be patient with him. He has good intentions, but different backgrounds and all that." And in that moment, I felt the weight of every assumption being made about me. So let me introduce myself properly. My name is David Mitchell. I'm 56 years old and I earn $40,000. No, not per year, but per month. Yet my own son, Mark, has absolutely no idea. And as I stood there that night, I knew I was about to learn exactly what kind of family he had married into. But before I go any further, take a second to like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Thank you. Because you're probably wondering why someone making close to $500,000 a year would go out of his way to appear ordinary. And that story began 7 years earlier when Mark was still in college, back when I had built my tech consultant firm from the ground up, slowly earning the trust of Fortune 500 companies and securing government contracts, only to discover very quickly that wealth has a way of distorting people's perception of you. A lesson my ex-wife's family taught me painfully well when success entered my life, and suddenly they were everywhere, hands extended. Old connections revived, long-forgotten relationships magically important again. So I made a decision to stay invisible, keeping the same 2008 Honda Civic I'd owned before any of it, living in the same small 2-bedroom home, dressing in plain Target clothes. And whenever Mark came by, I'd tuck the tailored suits away in storage and leave the Tesla parked at the office, letting him see a father who worked hard, lived modestly, and respected every dollar he earned, never once mentioning the investment accounts, the rental vacation properties, or the $2 million I had quietly set aside for his future, money he would only ever receive after proving to himself that he could create something on his own. Then, 3 weeks ago, Mark called me, his voice tight with excitement and nerves, to say that Jessica's parents, the Harringtons, had finally agreed to meet me, explaining they lived in Westchester and came from old money, and that they were uneasy about their daughter marrying below her social level, words he repeated without realizing how deeply they cut, even after 3 years of dating and 1 year of marriage, during which I had carefully remained busy whenever a meeting was suggested, until now when he added, "Dad, just try to make a good impression, okay? Maybe don't talk about the Honda, and if they ask what you do, just say consultant. They don't need all the details about your little contracts." A phrase that almost made me smile, knowing that one of those little contracts from last month involved federal cybersecurity infrastructure. But instead, I responded the way I always do, telling him not to worry and that I'd just be myself, because that night I fully intended to be exactly who everyone expected me to be, or at least the carefully crafted version of me they had already decided to see.
On the morning of the dinner, I found myself standing in my walk-in closet, slowly sliding my hand across two very different versions of my life. The left side lined with tailored suits and polished Italian leather shoes, the right reserved for what I privately called my Mark wardrobe, Walmart polos, Old Navy khakis, and an aging pair of loafers I'd picked up at Payless shortly before it disappeared. And without much hesitation, I chose a particularly unfortunate green polo that practically announced I had no idea how to dress for an upscale evening, and matched it with khakis that stopped just a little too high at the ankle. Then studied my reflection and nearly laughed, because the same face that had appeared on the cover of Tech Entrepreneur Monthly not long ago now looked indistinguishable from a working-class dad desperately trying to blend in at a country club. And during the drive to Westchester, I had plenty of time to reflect on why I'd kept this performance alive for so many years, realizing it hadn't only been about my ex-wife's family, though they were the spark, because after Linda and I divorced 28 years earlier, her relatives suddenly rediscovered my existence. One cousin pitching a guaranteed business opportunity, her brother urging me to back a restaurant despite never having worked in food service, and her mother insisting I somehow owed them for supporting me back when I had nothing, conveniently forgetting how they once laughed at my ambitions. But with Mark, the reason became deeper, more personal, as I wanted him to care about me as a father rather than as a bank account, to build his own drive instead of riding on my success. And in truth, it had worked better than I could have hoped, since he graduated with honors, secured his own position at a marketing firm, and never asked me for money beyond the occasional shared meal when things were tight, growing into a proud, independent, hard-working man. And just as I was thinking that, my phone buzzed through the Honda's ancient speakers. Yes, I'd installed Bluetooth, I have limits, and Mark's anxious voice came through asking if I was really coming this time and not planning to cancel again. To which I assured him I was already en route with 20 minutes left on the GPS, prompting a rapid-fire list of instructions about using the side entrance instead of the main door, parking on the street rather than the circular drive, and absolutely avoiding beer if drinks were offered because they were wine people, a comment that nearly made me mention the temperature-controlled wine cellar in my house holding bottles that cost more than my car, though I simply agreed, nodded mentally when he warned me to smile politely if Jessica's brother Thomas started talking about investments, because he was between ventures, a phrase I'd learned was polite code for unemployed trust fund optimism, and listened as he added that Jessica's mother, Victoria, might seem distant, but that it wasn't personal, just how she treated anyone outside their circle. A word Mark said as if he were already inside it, even though the insecurity in his voice suggested otherwise. And when I finally arrived, the Harrington estate unfolded across 3 acres of manicured perfection, the sort where grass looked trimmed with surgical precision and hedges obeyed geometry. The massive red brick house rising with white columns that pretended subtlety. So I parked my Honda on the street between a landscaping truck and a catering van and walked past at least 6 visible security cameras toward the side entrance, which required passing through a garden likely worth more than most homes. And before I could ring the bell, the door opened to reveal a man in a proper butler's uniform who glanced at me with polite confusion and suggested the delivery entrance was around back while already beginning to close the door, forcing me to introduce myself as David, Mark's father, here for dinner, at which point his expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and reluctant acceptance before settling into professionalism as he apologized and ushered me inside, where the foyer alone dwarfed my carefully modest house with its marble floors, palace-worthy chandelier, and unmistakably authentic art, something my career had trained my eye to recognize. And as we passed through corridors lined with family portraits, radiating inherited confidence, untouched by financial anxiety, we entered what they apparently considered the casual dining room, casually furnished with only 16 chairs, where Mark leapt up the moment he saw me, relief flashing briefly before his gaze dropped to my outfit with barely hidden alarm as he introduced me to the room, prompting Harold Harrington to rise slowly with a handshake engineered to assert dominance and a tone that made it clear whatever he'd heard about me wasn't flattering, while Victoria remained seated and extended her hand as if expecting tribute, commenting on how exhausting the drive must have been, and asking where exactly I lived before labeling Riverside quaint in the way some people might describe a disease. Jessica at least attempting a strained smile and polite greeting, while Mark studied his water glass as if it held answers. And then there was Thomas, lounging comfortably, slightly soft around the edges, sporting a Harvard Business School shirt like a credential badge, offering me nothing more than a dismissive wave as his mother announced his recent networking trip to Aspen. And by the time I noticed the seating arrangement, with Harold and Victoria anchoring opposite ends, their children placed neatly beside them, Mark squeezed next to Jessica, and my chair added awkwardly at the corner, not quite part of the table and not entirely excluded, I understood exactly where I stood before a single word of dinner conversation had begun. The purgatory seat, I thought, as Harold asked with polite stiffness whether I'd like something to drink and proudly mentioned an excellent manzanilla breathing on the table. But before I could respond, Mark hurriedly cut in to explain that I usually drank beer, a word Victoria repeated as if it belonged to a forgotten dialect, before remarking how refreshingly unusual it was and noting they didn't believe they had any. Perhaps the staff could check the garage. So I smiled and asked for water instead, enjoying the visible easing of tension as though a small disaster had been narrowly avoided and the wine glasses saved from contamination. Then the first course arrived, a deconstructed salad that looked like a garden accident, which Victoria explained came from their personal chef, trained in Paris, and I nodded appreciatively while mentally calculating that the 3 lettuce fragments and decorative sauce streak likely cost more than a typical family's weekly groceries. And as Harold delicately dissected a single cherry tomato, Harold asked about my consulting work with a tone that implied it was anything but interesting, assuming I handled small, local clients of various sizes, prompting Thomas to snort about how tough things must be now that all the real money is in tech disruption, announcing he himself was developing a revolutionary app that would change how people think about thinking, nearly making me choke on my water, as he assured me the technical side was too complex for someone like me, while Victoria beamed about his vision and proudly noted he'd been developing the concept for 3 years, a time frame during which I built and sold 2 companies. And before the performance could go any further, I took a moment to remind viewers to like, subscribe, and support the channel if they were enjoying the story. After which Harold smoothly redirected the discussion back to his preferred subject, himself lamenting that people today didn't understand pedigree or breeding and mistakenly believed anyone could start a business and call themselves successful. A sentiment Victoria eagerly echoed as she remarked on her surprise when Jessica brought Mark home, quickly adding that he'd done admirably well given his circumstances, prompting me to ask innocently what circumstances she meant, as she gestured vaguely toward my modest income and single-parent past, with Mark softly defending me but carrying an unmistakable note of embarrassment that cut deeper than their words, leading Harold to offer unsolicited financial advice and pitch an exclusive guaranteed investment opportunity with a discounted buy-in.
Which I thanked him for while recognizing the structure instantly, as Victoria chimed in about helping extended family and casually mentioned bags of Harold's old clothes in the garage that might be a nice upgrade for special occasions, eyeing my polo shirt as though it were hazardous material. And when the main course arrived, a portion of lamb small enough to conceal beneath a business card, I noticed everyone else received wine from one bottle, while my glass was filled from another, cheaper one. A message delivered without words, reinforced as Thomas, several glasses into the good stuff, advised me to get into apps if I wanted real money, and suggested I might be too old to grasp the digital landscape, while Victoria proudly credited him with revolutionizing social media at Harvard, until Jessica muttered about the incident that got him suspended, which Thomas hastily reframed as a misunderstanding of his vision, only for Harold to pivot again and suggest Mark should come work for him to learn real business, dismissing my input when I said Mark loved his job and pushing the idea of true success versus merely getting by, a distinction Victoria clarified with a laugh as levels of thriving beyond what I had managed, the condescension so thick it was almost tangible, made worse by Mark's silence as Harold poured more wine for everyone but me from his prized collection, and Thomas announced another pivot toward blockchain while jokingly asking whether I even had email, just as my phone vibrated on the table and I excused myself to take a call, enduring Victoria's remark about hourly work before stepping into the hall where Sarah, perfectly briefed, spoke loudly enough to carry about Microsoft moving a $7.3 million contract signing and the Department of Defense clearing my Pentagon project, to which I responded calmly before declining Forbes again, returning to find forks frozen mid-air and faces drained of color, correcting Thomas on the figure and asking him about blockchain integration with a curiosity that left him speechless, prompting Harold to question what he'd overheard and me to explain it was a mid-size contract for us, casually inquiring whether Thomas was building on Ethereum or creating his own protocol, watching his confidence evaporate as Jessica demanded to know how I knew about such things, answering simply that I read. And when my phone buzzed again, I deliberately left it face up as a message from my CFO confirmed Q3 profits at $4.8 million, the silence that followed saying more than any speech ever could.
Champagne worthy, I thought, as Victoria leaned forward just enough to pretend she wasn't trying to read my phone, and I watched her expression subtly shift when the numbers finally registered, her voice changing to something far more careful as she remarked that my phone seemed unusually busy for a Saturday night, to which I replied calmly that it was an occupational hazard when you deal with international clients across different time zones, slipping the phone into my pocket, but not before a notification from my investment app briefly lit the screen with my portfolio value, something I knew she'd caught because the color drained from her face, prompting Harold to clear his throat and ask, far more politely now, what exactly I meant when I said consulting. So I shrugged and described it as a mix of cybersecurity infrastructure, AI integration, and digital transformation for organizations still clinging to legacy systems, calling it boring work, which made Mark laugh nervously as he admitted I'd never mentioned AI or cybersecurity before, and that he thought I just helped small businesses with their computers. And I nodded, saying every client matters, whether it's a neighborhood bakery or a Fortune 500 company, a phrase that made Thomas squeak as if something inside him snapped. And as I reached for a tissue from my wallet, I did it deliberately slowly, letting my American Express black card slide onto the table with its unmistakable metallic clink, freezing every gaze in place as the Centurion card caught the light, the one you can't apply for, the one that only finds you after you've spent obscene amounts of money. And I casually murmured, "Oops," as I picked it up, while Harold cycled through several facial colors before landing on a deep, unsettled purple, and asked if that was what he thought it was, prompting me to glance at it dismissively and complain about metal cards being a nuisance at airport security, as Victoria's hand trembled slightly while reaching for the good wine, their wine, not the bottle meant for me, until Mark slowly asked where I'd gotten a card like that, and I smiled gently and told him, "You don't get these, they come to you," before neatly turning the conversation back on Harold and his earlier investment pitch, asking about returns, which left him momentarily speechless as he muttered something about exclusivity and suggested discussing it privately, only for me to wave that off and explain that I usually didn't evaluate anything under a few million, since due diligence took the same effort regardless of scale, and it was more efficient to focus on larger opportunities. At which point Thomas snapped and began furiously typing my name into his phone, whispering David Mitchell, cybersecurity consultant, before his eyes widened and he shoved the screen toward Harold, displaying the TechCrunch article about my company's expansion with a photo of me ringing the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, causing Harold to stare between the phone and my face like reality itself had glitched, while I waved it off as IPO fuss and admitted photographers made it awkward, a word that sent Mark scrambling to his feet, demanding to know what IPO, as Jessica grabbed the phone and scrolled through valuation figures she insisted couldn't be right, to which I modestly replied valuations were always inflated and probably 30% lower, a comment that made Thomas shout the adjusted number aloud in disbelief, while Victoria sat utterly silent, her practiced composure cracking as she kept looking between me and her husband as if waiting for one of us to laugh and reveal the joke, Mark sinking back into his chair, asking why I'd never told him, and me explaining gently that he'd never asked and always seemed embarrassed by my little contracts, his voice breaking as he realized I was wealthier than the Harringtons, a comparison I discouraged politely while noting Harold's flinch, just as Jessica's phone chimed again, and she gasped while showing Victoria the Forbes Tech 50 list with my name sitting at number 37, something I dismissed as an oddly ranked year, while Thomas continued spiraling aloud through search results listing my patents, global forums, and private dinners with industry leaders, the room now silent except for the sound of assumptions collapsing one by one.
Elon talks a lot at dinner, I said lightly, barely letting anyone else speak. And that was the moment Harold pushed back his chair so hard the legs screeched against the floor as he stood, insisting there had clearly been some kind of misunderstanding, to which I had tilted my head and asked what exactly he meant, because for the first time all evening, Victoria opened her mouth and then closed it again, completely out of words, so I said it plainly for them. You assumed I was poor and you treated me that way, letting the silence hang heavy as Harold tried to argue they'd been perfectly polite, only for me to calmly list every slight: the corner seat, the cheaper wine, the offer of discarded clothes, the implication that my son should feel lucky to marry into their family, and Thomas wondering if I even knew what email was. Each sentence landing harder than the last, as Thomas shrank, Victoria clutched her throat, and Jessica weakly pointed to my car and clothes as if they explained everything, which gave me the opening to say I liked my Honda because it worked, and that clothes were just fabric, no more a measure of worth than her designer dress, though I couldn't resist adding that hers likely cost more than most people's rent, prompting Harold to abruptly soften, his voice turning nervous as he suggested we reset and talk business, even hinting that he had ventures suited for someone of my caliber, the sudden warmth so transparent it was almost comical. So I asked about the exclusive investment he'd mentioned earlier, and pointed out it sounded exactly like a pyramid scheme, watching his face blanch as he tried to dress it up as multi-level marketing, which I translated aloud, before turning to Thomas and asking whether 3 years of app development without a single line of code sounded accurate, then calmly shifting the spotlight to Harold by revealing that his company had filed for Chapter 11 8 months earlier, that the debts were public record, the house mortgaged multiple times, the cars leased, even this lavish dinner likely charged to maxed-out credit cards, exposing the hypocrisy of judging others from inside a collapsing house of cards, which finally made Mark ask me to stop, and that hurt more than anything else, because he hadn't stopped them when they demeaned me, hadn't defended me once, choosing their approval over my dignity, leading Jessica to accuse me of cruelty, a word I echoed back while reminding her of the charity close, the scam pitch, and the mocking questions, pointing out that it only felt cruel now because the man they dismissed turned out to have more than they did, as Victoria whispered they hadn't known, which was exactly my point, because ignorance had revealed their true character, empty and transactional. And as I stood and pulled on my jacket, I told them real wealth was raising a son who earned his own way and once had integrity, something I feared I hadn't seen tonight, asking Mark directly whether this was truly the family he wanted to align himself with, just as Harold accused me of orchestrating the whole thing to humiliate them, which I denied, explaining I'd simply watched them do that themselves, an assessment Thomas unexpectedly agreed with in a bitter laugh, as he admitted they were broke and pretending, finally speaking truth aloud, until Victoria snapped at him, only for him to insist honesty mattered, prompting me to offer Harold one last piece of advice to escape the scam before it took what little he had left. Tell Thomas his app idea had already failed years ago, and that real learning required work, not pedigree, and to ask Jessica whether she truly wanted Mark to become like her father or brother. Then turning to my son to say I loved him, but that tonight revealed he'd been hiding too, chasing approval at the cost of self-respect, asking whether their acceptance was worth losing who he was, listening as he begged to explain and apologized, only to tell him the choice had already been made when he asked me to use the side door and sat silent while I was belittled, asking the question that mattered most: was he proud of me now only because I was rich? And before leaving, delivering one final truth to Victoria about the wine she'd given me, quietly informing her it was rarer and more valuable than the one she'd served herself, misjudged because she valued labels over knowledge, walking out to the sound of glass shattering behind me, sitting in my Honda afterward without starting it as the rush faded into grief, realizing I hadn't lost my son to marriage but to materialism. Until the passenger door opened and Mark climbed in, red-eyed and shaken, asking to talk now that we were alone, admitting he failed me and wanting to understand why I'd hidden everything, prompting me to finally tell him the truth about his mother leaving us for a richer man when he was 2, calling me worthless, and how I'd vowed that night to raise him to value people over money, keeping my success separate so he'd love me as a father, not a wallet, asking him whether his love now was any different, forcing him to admit he would have acted differently if he'd known, which was the real failure,
and as we sat in silence watching the Harrington house blaze with light behind us, I told him what happened next was his choice: either return to that illusion and live for appearances, or become the man I raised him to be, listening as he laughed bitterly, knowing the decision would define the rest of his life.
What she has? Mark shot back, bitterly amused. Dad, they're broke. I know, I've known for months. I did my research before we ever came here, and I nodded because that part wasn't news to me, telling him that being broke wasn't just about money, that his in-laws were bankrupt in deeper ways, spiritually, morally, and slowly turning him into the same kind of person, prompting Mark to defend Jessica by insisting she wasn't like them, which forced me to say the uncomfortable truth that she had sat there while they insulted me, had softened their cruelty with excuses before I even arrived, and had been raised to see the world through their distorted lens, leaving the real question of whether she could ever unlearn it, just as the front door opened and Jessica appeared, backlit and unsteady, walking toward the car with the look of someone who had lost the ground beneath her feet, timing that made me quietly remark, speaking of which, as she reached Mark's window, her makeup ruined and hair undone, asking if she could talk to both of us, Mark looking to me for permission, and me nodding as she climbed into the back seat and confessed her shame, not just for the night, but for the person she'd become under her family's influence, leading me to tell her this wasn't about shame at all, but about choice, about what she planned to do next, her voice barely above a whisper as she said she didn't want to be like them, admitting she'd watched her family shift from dismissive to desperate the moment they learned about my money, and realizing how disgusting that transformation was, including her own complicity, which softened my voice as I reminded her that youth comes with mistakes, and what matters is whether you learn from them. Jessica turning to Mark and saying his father had exposed everything she'd been trying to ignore for years, that her family was a facade built on debt and denial, a house of cards waiting to collapse, asking what came next, and I told them both the answer was simpler than they expected. Start over, stop chasing approval from people who don't deserve it, live within your means, respect honestly earned money more than inherited debt, and judge people by what they do, not what they own. Mark asking quietly if I could forgive him, and me answering that forgiveness wasn't the real issue, that understanding was. Understanding that the man he'd felt embarrassed by was the same man who built a company from nothing, raised him alone, and chose an old Honda because objects don't define us. Mark saying he finally understood, and Jessica agreeing, half laughing through tears as she predicted her parents were already plotting how to get to my money, her father rehearsing his pitch, her mother polishing an apology, and Thomas likely updating his LinkedIn to claim proximity, a comment that made me laugh despite everything, before Jessica firmly declared she didn't want their life or their future of debt and self-importance, to which I replied that choosing differently really was that simple. Mark reaching for my hand and saying he didn't want my money as inheritance, but wanted to earn his own way, squeezing his hand and recognizing the son I'd raised, smiling when he asked if instead of money, I could teach him how to build something real. Jessica quickly adding that she wanted to learn too, that she had a business degree she'd never used because working was considered beneath her. And as I looked at them, two kids really, trying to untangle truth from illusion, I felt hope for the first time that night, agreeing on one condition, that they'd start from the bottom, learn everything, fail, try again, with no shortcuts, no handouts, no nepotism, a deal they accepted together, before I added one final rule: Sunday dinner at my real house, the one Mark had never seen, cooking together the way we used to, no servants, no pretending, just family. Something Jessica said she genuinely wanted, and as I started the Honda, Mark asked why I'd kept the car all these years, making me smile as I told him it reminded me where I came from, and more importantly, that happiness isn't about what you drive, but where you're headed and who's beside you. Pulling away from the Harrington estate and its hollow shine, while in the mirror I saw Harold in the doorway, phone pressed to his ear, probably scrambling for a way to reach me that he'd never find, because my real number was reserved for people who saw a man, not a balance sheet. Mark telling me he loved me, the real me, Honda included, and me answering that I knew. And 6 months later, watching him and Jessica build a legitimate company from the ground up, still struggling, still learning, driving used cars and living small, but happier than they'd ever been pretending, while the Harrington empire finally collapsed, the house gone, Harold ruined, Thomas actually working for the first time at 30,
learning the hard way that sometimes you have to hit bottom to understand direction. And as for me, still driving the Honda, still wearing simple clothes, still living quietly, because money doesn't define who you are, it reveals who you've been all along. And that night it revealed not just the emptiness of the Harringtons, but that the real Mark, the one I raised, had only lost his way for a moment, needing nothing more than a reminder that worth isn't measured in dollars at all, but in sense, common sense.